The day Amos Keating walked past his empty fields without so much as glancing at the turned earth, his neighbor Earl Duggan said to his wife that a man who stops planting has already started dying, and Earl Duggan was not wrong. That was in the spring of 1883, in the territory of Kansas, where the wind came down flat and mean off the prairie, and the sky stretched so wide it made a person feel both free and swallowed whole at the same time. Amos owned 40 acres of good bottomland south of the town of Harlow Creek, a modest settlement of maybe 300 souls pressed between a ribbon of cottonwood trees and the red dirt road that connected it to Dodge City some 30 miles east. The land was excellent land, dark and deep, the kind of soil that rewarded a man who worked it with honest abundance. Under Amos's first wife, Clara, those 40 acres had produced corn and winter wheat and enough kitchen garden vegetables to fill a root cellar to bursting every autumn. Clara had been dead 14 months when Virginia Rhodes stepped off the southbound stage in Harlow Creek with a carpetbag in one hand, a letter of introduction in the other, and enough dried prairie mud caked onto her palms and forearms to suggest she had recently been doing serious work in the earth. But the story properly begins before Virginia arrived, because to understand why she mattered so much, a person first had to understand what Amos had become. Amos Keating was 34 years old and built the way the Kansas plains seemed to prefer building its men, wide through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with hands that looked too large for the rest of him, and a jaw set at an angle that could mean either determination or stubbornness depending on who was reading it. He had sand-colored hair that the sun had bleached to something close to pale gold, and eyes the same shade of gray-green as sage brush after a rain. People who had known him before Clara died said he had once been the kind of man who laughed easily and often, who had a particular way of leaning against a fence post and telling a story that made everyone around him feel like the best version of themselves. After Clara died, he was none of those things. He was simply present, like a tool left out in the yard, functional in the most basic sense but going slowly to rust. Clara had died of fever in February of 1882. She had been 28 years old, and she and Amos had been married 6 years, and they had built the farmhouse together with help from neighboring families the first summer, and they had dug the kitchen garden together and planted the first seeds together and watched the first crop come up together. And all of that togetherness had been so thoroughly woven into every inch of the land that, when Clara was gone, the land itself seemed to Amos like a monument to her absence, rather than a living thing that could still give him anything worth having. He had buried her in the far corner of the east field, under a cottonwood sapling they had planted the year they were married. The sapling was taller now. Its roots went down into the same earth where Clara lay. That spring, the spring of 1882, Amos did not plant. He told himself it was grief and that he would recover by summer. Summer came and the field stayed fallow and choked with volunteer grass. He told himself he would plant in the fall winter wheat at least. Fall came and he watched Earl Duggan's fields go golden with harvest visible from his own porch, and he did not plant. Winter passed. The spring of 1883 arrived wet and promising, and still the fields lay empty, and still Amos sat on his porch each morning with a cup of coffee and looked at the ground as though it had done something to personally offend him. He kept a small number of chickens and a milk cow and a gelding named Dutch, and those animals kept him from starving because they required almost nothing of him beyond the mechanical motions of feeding and watering. He ate simply. He slept without sleeping well. He went to town once a week for supplies and spoke to people when they spoke to him, and rode home again and was alone. The Reverend had spoken to him twice about his state of mind. Earl Duggan had brought him food on 3 separate occasions, each time accompanied by the kind of hearty male encouragement that was meant kindly but landed without effect. The schoolteacher, a woman named Mrs. Partridge, had organized a women's aid basket twice and left it on his porch. Amos had eaten the food and left the basket out for returning and had not planted anything. It was Earl Duggan who, in early March of 1883, had the idea that what Amos needed was a woman. Not just any woman, he was quick to clarify to his wife Ruth over supper, but a woman with practical sense and some backbone. A woman who understood farm work and would not expect Amos to be something he was not right now, which was cheerful. Earl had heard from a man in Dodge City about a placement service out of Missouri that matched single women in difficult circumstances with farmers in the territory who had need of a capable partner. It was not precisely a mail-order arrangement, in that the service preferred to call itself a vocational and social match service, but the practical effect was similar. A woman agreed to come west. A man agreed to receive her. They met. If it suited both of them, they could pursue a courtship with an eye toward marriage. If it did not suit, the woman was given return fare, and the man was expected to provide a month of honest wages for the work she had done. Earl wrote the letter on Amos's behalf, which is to say he wrote it without Amos's knowledge. When Amos received the reply 6 weeks later, including a brief letter of introduction from the woman herself, he sat on his porch and read it 3 times and felt nothing in particular except a distant and formless irritation at Earl Duggan that did not quite harden into real anger, because underneath the irritation was something smaller and quieter that might, if pressed, have been recognized as the faintest suggestion of curiosity. Virginia Rhodes wrote a clear, direct letter. She had not ornamented it with false promises or pretty language. She had stated that she was 26 years old and from a farming family outside of Springfield, Missouri. She had stated that she had grown up working land and understood the labor required. She had stated that she had been widowed herself at 24, her husband having died of a mining accident in the Colorado Territory, and that she had spent the following 2 years working for a woman who ran a boarding house in Springfield while trying to decide what to do next. She had stated that she was not afraid of hard work, not prone to hysterics, and not interested in a man who needed managing, but in a man who needed a partner. She had stated that she did not know if she and whoever received this letter would suit each other, but that she thought it was worth finding out. There was one additional sentence at the bottom of the letter, written in slightly smaller script as though added after the rest had been sealed and then reopened again, and it said, "I have always believed that a field left unplanted is a kind of conversation between a person and the earth, and that the earth is patient enough to wait. But I find I prefer working land to waiting." Amos folded the letter back into its envelope and set it on the kitchen table where it stayed for 4 days. On the 5th day he wrote back. His letter was brief. He said she was welcome to come. He gave the date of the next southbound stage through Harlow Creek. He signed it Amos Keating and added nothing decorative. Virginia Rhodes packed her carpetbag and came. The stage rolled into Harlow Creek on a Wednesday afternoon in late April of 1883, and Amos was standing in front of the general store because he had told himself he had business there that had nothing to do with the stage. The stage pulled up to the post office, and 3 passengers climbed down, 2 men who were apparently continuing their journey and had only stopped to stretch their legs, and 1 woman. She was not what Amos had been imagining in the vague, resistant way he had permitted himself to imagine her. He had expected something softer, something more uncertain, something that would look at the raw country around it with the expression of a person who was regretting a decision. Virginia Rhodes climbed down from the stage with the unhurried ease of someone who was comfortable in her own body, and looked at Harlow Creek with frank, direct interest, the way a person looks at a new piece of land they are considering working. She was medium height with dark hair pinned up under a dusty blue bonnet, and she had strong hands, which Amos noticed because she was already carrying her own carpetbag and adjusting it against her hip with the practiced movement of someone accustomed to hauling things without assistance. There was dried earth on her hands and lower forearms, reddish-brown against her skin, and it was clear she had been doing something agricultural before she boarded the stage. She looked around the street. She found him quickly because he was the only man standing in front of the general store looking at her with the expression of a person who was both present and resistant to being present at the same time. She walked directly to him. "You are Amos Keating," she said. It was not quite a question. "I am," he said. "Virginia Rhodes," she said, and held out the hand that was carrying the carpet bag, realized it was the wrong hand, switched the bag, and extended the other. There was still dirt on it. She looked at it briefly and said, "I was helping a woman on the stage with her window box. She had sweet potato slips that needed settling and the soil was wrong. I hope you do not mind the state of my hands." Amos looked at her hand and then at her face and then shook her hand. Her grip was firm and she did not perform any of the delicacy that he had been bracing for. "I do not mind," he said. They stood in the street for a moment, and the afternoon light came sideways through the cottonwoods, and Virginia Rhodes looked at him with her clear dark eyes, and Amos Keating felt something that he had not felt in 14 months, which was the faint and alarming sensation of being actually seen by another person. "Well," she said, "shall we go see this farm?" He led her to the wagon where Dutch was tied at the hitching post and helped her up onto the bench and climbed up himself, and they drove the 2 miles out to the farm in a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable. When the farm came into view, Virginia Rhodes said nothing for a moment. She took it in, the white farmhouse that needed paint on the south side, the chicken yard, the woodshed, the barn that was in good repair, the vast empty fields stretching out to either side of the lane, not a single planted row among them, just the raw earth and the volunteer grass and the insistent spring wind moving over all of it. "Those are your fields," she said. "They are," said Amos. "How long since they were planted?" "A while," said Amos. She turned and looked at him directly, not accusingly, just the way a person looks at a problem they are measuring. "Your wife," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned back to the fields. "The soil looks good from here," she said. "It is good soil," he said, and there was something slightly raw in his voice that surprised him, because he had not intended for anything to be in his voice at all. "Then we have something to work with," she said, and climbed down from the wagon before he could offer to help her. That first night, Virginia Rhodes slept in the spare room that Clara had used as a sewing room, which Amos had cleared of most of Clara's things in the months after her death. There was a narrow bed there and a chest of drawers and a braided rug. Virginia did not comment on the room being somewhat sparse. She said it was fine, and Amos believed she meant it. He cooked supper, which was beans and salt pork and cornbread, and she sat across the table from him and ate without complaint and asked him questions about the farm. Practical questions. How many acres was the bottomland versus the upslope? What had he typically planted and in what rotation? What was the water situation? Was there a well? Was there a creek? He answered the questions in the same practical spirit, and found that the conversation was almost easy in the way that conversations about concrete things are easier than conversations about how a person is feeling, which suited them both apparently. She asked about the gelding and the cow and the chickens. She asked about what supplies he had in the barn. She asked if he had seed stored. He said he had some seed from 2 seasons back that had been stored properly and would likely still be viable, and he thought he saw something shift in her expression when he said this. Not pity exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that understood what it meant that the seed had been properly stored against the chance of planting for 2 seasons, and the planting had never happened. "Tell me about what grew best," she said. And Amos, who had not talked about his land or his farming with any real engagement in over a year, began to talk. He said the bottomland was best for corn, and that the east section of the upper field caught light well and had been good for winter wheat. He said Clara had kept a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, protected from the worst of the wind, and it had produced better than most of the kitchen gardens in the area, because she had understood how to amend the soil with wood ash and kitchen compost. He stopped talking when he realized he had said Clara's name out loud, and that saying it had not caused the sudden, destabilizing grief that it usually did, but rather something more like a steady ache, the kind that did not knock a person down but just walked alongside them. Virginia Rhodes said, "She sounds like she knew what she was doing." "She did," said Amos. "Good farmers leave something in the land," Virginia said. "I believe that. Whatever she put into it, it is still there." Amos looked at her across the table, and the lamplight was warm and the prairie was dark outside the window, and something in those words landed in a place in him that had been closed for a long time. He did not say anything because he did not have words that would have been adequate. He simply nodded. After supper, she washed the dishes and he dried them, and they moved around the small kitchen without getting in each other's way, which he recognized as a thing that required a certain kind of ease, and he was surprised to find the ease there. She went to bed early because she had been traveling since before dawn. He sat on the porch for a long time in the dark and listened to the prairie wind and thought about the fact that tomorrow, in all likelihood, Virginia Rhodes was going to want to look at his fields close up, and that he was going to have to stand in those fields, which he had been avoiding for over a year. He was right about that. The next morning she was up before him, which he discovered when he came down to the kitchen, and found a pot of coffee already on and a pan of cornmeal porridge staying warm by the stove, and Virginia herself was not in the house. He found her in the east field, crouched down with her hands deep in the soil, turning it over and lifting it and letting it fall and doing it again, her bonnet hanging down her back by its ties, her hair catching the early morning light. He walked out to her and stood a few feet away, and she looked up at him. "Amos," she said, "this is extraordinary soil. Do you understand what you have here?" He understood it abstractly in the way he had understood everything about his land since Clara died, as information rather than feeling. "I know it is good land," he said. She stood up. Her hands were dark with the earth she had been turning. She held them up slightly, palms out, as though presenting evidence. "This is not just good land," she said, with a conviction that was almost fervent. "This is the kind of land that a person back in Missouri would barter their best mare for. This topsoil goes down at least a foot before you hit clay. There is good moisture here from the winter. If we get seed in within the next 2 weeks, you could have corn that would make your neighbor weep with envy." Something about the straightforwardness of her enthusiasm, the total absence of any performance in it, the fact that she was standing in his fallow field at sunrise with dirt on her hands, and talking about his land as though it were a personal friend she was greeting after a long absence, cracked something open in Amos that he had not known was sealed. "We," he said, slightly. "Unless you prefer I say you," she said, and her tone was careful, giving him room. "No," he said, "we is fine." She smiled then, just briefly, a small and genuine smile that changed her face from interesting to something considerably warmer, and she turned back to the field. "Then we need to talk about seed corn. What you have stored may be adequate, but I want to see it first." They walked back to the barn together, and Amos opened the storage bins, and she went through the seed corn methodically, testing kernels between her fingers for firmness, checking for evidence of mold or insect damage, asking questions about storage conditions. She said most of it was still good, and they had enough for planting the east bottomland section at least. She said she wanted to send to the mercantile in town for additional seed potatoes, and she had some questions about whether Amos had kept any saved seed from the kitchen garden. He had. He had not known why he had kept it. Some habit of Clara's had gotten inside him, and he had dried the tomato seeds and the cucumber seeds and the bean seeds at the end of each autumn without quite deciding to, and had kept them in labeled paper envelopes in the pantry without knowing what for. He showed her the envelopes. She looked through them and said quietly, "She labeled them in such neat handwriting." "She did," said Amos. "She wanted someone to use them," Virginia said. It was not a sentimental statement. It was an observation, practical and plain. Seeds kept this carefully are meant for planting. They are not meant to sit. The words were not addressed at him in any aggressive way. They were simply true, and Amos knew they were true, and he felt the truth of them in a place that was somewhere between his chest and his stomach. "I know," he said. "Then let us honor that," said Virginia Rhodes. That afternoon they drove the wagon to Harlow Creek and bought seed potatoes, and a paper of carrot seed and some twine. When they stopped at the general store, the proprietor, a man named Curtis Bell, looked at Virginia Rhodes with the frank assessment that small-town storekeepers tend to apply to newcomers, then looked at Amos with something between approval and cautious satisfaction. "This the woman Earl Duggan arranged," Curtis Bell said to Amos, in the way that small towns talk about things that are technically private in completely public tones. "Virginia Rhodes," Amos said. "Miss Rhodes, this is Curtis Bell." "Pleased to meet you," Virginia said, with a composure that indicated she was accustomed to being assessed and had made her peace with it. "Welcome to Harlow Creek," Curtis said. "You let me know if you need anything and I cannot stock it. I will order it from Dodge City within a week generally." "I appreciate that," she said. "I would like to know if you carry sulfur dust. We may need it for the potato patch." Curtis blinked, then grinned. "I do, as a matter of fact. Not many folks ask." "Not many folks plan their potato patches properly," Virginia said pleasantly, and Amos, who had been standing next to her, found himself making a sound that it took him a moment to identify as a laugh. Not a large laugh, just a small one, the kind that escapes before a person has decided to make it. But Curtis Bell looked at him with the expression of a man watching a crocus push up through late snow, and Virginia Rhodes looked at him sideways with a quick, warm glance that she then deliberately looked away from, and Amos cleared his throat and bought the seed potatoes and the sulfur dust, and they went back to the wagon. He helped her up this time, and she let him. The first week was all work. Virginia Rhodes worked the way she had described herself working in her letter, without drama and without flagging, from early morning until the light went, and then sometimes by lamplight in the kitchen, where she was planting rows on paper, and making lists of what needed doing in what order. Amos watched her and found himself doing something he had not done in 14 months, which was participating in the running of his own farm. He had forgotten how much satisfaction there was in the physical act of turning soil. He had forgotten the particular smell of good earth opened up in the spring, that green and ancient smell that was older than anything human. On the second morning, Virginia handed him a shovel and said she needed the kitchen garden area turned over before she could work any amendments into it, and he had taken the shovel and gone to the south side of the house, where Clara's kitchen garden had been, and for a moment had stood there with the shovel in his hands, feeling the full weight of absence. But Virginia was already on the other side of the garden area, turning her section over with efficient, practiced strokes, and there was something in watching her work, the ordinary reality of it, that made standing in that garden feel less like standing in a memorial and more like standing in a garden. He put the shovel into the earth. He turned the first furrow. The smell came up at him and he breathed it, and it was grief and memory, and also underneath both of those, the first quiet note of something else he did not have a name for yet. They worked until the garden was turned over. Virginia found a compost pile in the back corner that Amos had continued adding to without ever using, out of the same inexplicable automatic habit, and said it was perfect, and they forked it into the garden soil and worked it under. By midday Amos's back ached and his hands had the good soreness of real labor, and he was sweating through his shirt, and Virginia Rhodes had her sleeves rolled up and a streak of dark soil across her cheek, and was kneeling at the edge of the garden doing something careful and precise with the bean seeds in the labeled envelopes. "You know which rows you want those in?" he asked. "I know where Clara had them," she said, without looking up. "I found her garden plan in the pantry, tucked behind the seed envelopes." Amos went still. "I did not know she had a garden plan written out." Virginia turned and held it up. It was a folded piece of paper, done in pencil in Clara's neat hand, with the kitchen garden plotted out in squares and labeled. She had even noted which rows she wanted to rotate the following season. She had been planning for a future. Amos came and took the paper from Virginia's hand and looked at it for a long moment. The neat pencil squares, the careful labels. tomatoes south end morning sun, beans middle rows, cucumbers north end with trellis. He was quiet for a while, and Virginia was quiet beside him, and the wind moved through the yard and the chickens made their low, constant sound. She would want it planted, Amos said finally. Yes, said Virginia, I believe she would. He handed the garden plan back. Follow it, he said. We will follow it together, she said, and looked up at him from where she was kneeling in the dirt, and there was something in the steadiness of her dark eyes that he had to look away from for a moment because it was too much to look at directly, the way a particular quality of light can be. Over the days that followed, a rhythm established itself between them. Amos worked the big fields with the plow, breaking the caked grass and turning the rich soil in long rows, while Virginia followed behind working the furrows for seed, and in the evenings they sat on the porch and talked. The talking was not effortful. She told him about growing up in Missouri, the third of 5 children, her father a serious but gentle man who had taught her to read soil the way some men taught their daughters to read scripture. She told him about her husband, whose name had been Daniel, and how she had loved him in a young and bright way that the years had not had time to deepen before the mine accident. She did not perform grief when she talked about it. She simply said, I know what it is to have a person taken before you expected it, and left space in those words for him to hear what he needed to hear. He found himself talking about Clara in ways he had not been able to since her death. He told Virginia about the way Clara had always gone out to the fields at dusk and stood there as though listening to the land, and how he had teased her about it, and she had told him that the land had things to say if a person was quiet enough. He told her about the winter that the prairie fire had come close, and they had stood on the porch in the dark watching the horizon glow, and Clara had not been afraid, or had been afraid and had stood there anyway, which was essentially the same thing. He told her about the last weeks, the fever that had come and gone and come back stronger, and how he had sat beside her bed and held her hand, and she had told him not to let the land go to waste. She said that, Virginia said quietly. She said it twice, said Amos, and I went and let the land go to waste anyway. You were grieving, Virginia said. I was, he said, and I am not done grieving, but I think I confused grief with stopping. I think I thought that if I stopped doing the things I had done with her, I was holding on to her. But the land is not a monument. Clara knew that. She said it was a living thing. Virginia turned her face toward him on the porch, and the last light was gone, and the stars were coming up over the prairie, big and low the way they came up on the plains, and she said, she was right. She usually was, said Amos. There was a silence that was full rather than empty. And in that fullness, Amos became aware of how close Virginia was sitting, and how much he had told her, and how natural it had all felt, the telling of it, and he felt that awareness as a complicated thing. There was gratitude in it, and there was guilt in it, and underneath both of those there was something that was not yet nameable but that was present and warm and real. He said good night and went inside and lay in his bed listening to the prairie and knew that something was shifting in him like the deep turn of a plow blade, slow and inevitable, and going all the way down. The corn went in during the second week of May. This was, by the standards of 1883 Kansas farming, a reasonable planting date for corn, and the soil temperature was adequate and the moisture was good, and Virginia had checked the furrow depth 3 times before she was satisfied. They planted all day, she and Amos, moving along the rows in the east bottomland, dropping seed at measured intervals, covering it over, moving forward. It was the first time in 2 years that Amos Keating had planted seed in his own earth, and when he stood at the end of the first row and looked back at the length of it, he had to stand still for a moment and breathe deliberately, because the emotion was larger than he had been prepared for. Virginia stood beside him without speaking, which was the correct and generous response. After a moment he said, "That first row is done." "It is," she said. "We have about 50 more of them to do," he said. "We do," she said. "Then let us get to it," he said. By late afternoon, the East Bottomland was planted, and they were both dust-covered and tired in the satisfying, clean way that only real physical labor produces. Virginia sat down on the tailgate of the wagon and pulled her bonnet off and ran her hands through her loosened hair, and Amos, who had been unhitching Dutch from the plow, looked up and saw her sitting there in the evening light with her hair down and her face open and tired and content, and felt something in his chest perform a sudden and entirely unscheduled motion. He looked away. He finished unhitching Dutch, but the motion had happened and he could not unhappen it. At supper that evening, Virginia was brighter than usual, animated by the day's accomplishment, and she talked about what she expected the corn to look like in 6 weeks, and whether the potato patch on the west side was getting enough air circulation, and whether she thought they should risk putting in a second bean planting in June for a fall crop. Amos listened to her talk about his land as though it were her land too, without any possessive claim to it, simply with the affection and specificity of a person who was genuinely invested in its welfare. And he realized that he had been waiting a long time to talk about his land with another person who understood what land meant, and that Virginia Rhodes understood. After supper, she helped him repair a loose board on the chicken coop, because one of the hens was getting out and getting into the road, and they worked in the last of the dusk light with hammer and nails, and she held the board while he drove the nails, and at one point he reached past her to adjust the board's placement, and his hand briefly covered hers on the wood, and they both went still for a moment before he stepped back and said, "Sorry," and she said, "It is fine," in a voice that was perfectly steady, but perhaps slightly more deliberate than usual. He walked her to the door of the house that night and said good night, and she said good night and went inside, and Amos stood in the yard in the dark for a long time looking up at the stars and thinking about a board on a chicken coop, and the fact that he had said sorry for touching her hand and she had said it was fine, and he thought about what fine meant. 3 weeks into May, Earl Duggan came by. He came ostensibly to borrow a wagon chain, but this was transparently an excuse, as he and Ruth arrived together in their Sunday clothes on a Friday afternoon which was not a Sunday. They sat on the porch, and Ruth and Virginia talked with the ease of women who recognize in each other a similar quality of practicality, and Earl sat next to Amos and watched the first green sprouts of corn showing in the east field in the late afternoon light. "God in heaven," Earl said quietly, looking at the corn sprouts. "Amos." "I know," said Amos. "I did not know if I would ever see that field planted again," Earl said. "Neither did I," said Amos. Earl looked at Virginia, who was laughing at something Ruth had said, her face turned up and open. "She is something," Earl said, "the way she is with the land." "She is," said Amos. "The way she looks at you," Earl said carefully, "in the way of a man who is going out on a limb and knows it." "Is not nothing either." Amos said nothing, which Earl apparently correctly interpreted as confirmation, and said nothing more on the subject, but sat back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who has done a good deed and lived to see the results. After the Duggans left, Virginia stood in the yard watching the last light on the corn field, and Amos came and stood beside her. They stood there for a while. "Earl is a good man," she said. "He is," said Amos. "He wrote to the placement service without telling me." "I know," she said. "He told Ruth, who told me." "I should have been angry," Amos said. "But you were not?" she asked. "No," said Amos. She turned her head slightly toward him without quite looking at him. "I am glad of it too," she said, and her voice was quiet and honest and did not dress the statement up in anything more than it was. Amos turned to look at her profile against the evening sky, the clean line of her jaw and the loose strand of dark hair at her temple, and the way she held herself, straight and easy and certain of her own ground. He thought about the first day she had arrived with dirt on her hands, and the way she had walked directly to him in the street, as though she had already decided he was worth walking toward. "Virginia," he said. She turned to face him. They were close in the dusk, the warm smell of turned earth and growing things all around them, and the prairie stretching out enormous and beautiful on every side. "I want to tell you something, and I want to tell it to you honestly," he said. "I am not entirely out of grief. I do not know when I will be or if a person ever fully is, but I want you to know that I am glad you are here, not just for the land, for the talking. For the fact that you made me stand in that field and put my hands in the earth again. I had forgotten what it felt like to be in my own life, and you reminded me, and I do not take that lightly. Virginia was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them. I did not come here expecting to feel what I am feeling, she said carefully. I came here thinking I would be useful and that would be enough. I did not account for you. What does that mean? He asked, and his voice was low. It means, she said, that you are harder to look at and then look away from than I planned on. The admission landed between them in the warm evening air, and Amos felt it settle all the way through him. He reached out and took her hand, which was, as it often was, slightly rough from work and warm from the day, and he held it and she let him, and they stood there looking at the green field with the first corn rising out of the earth he had been unable to touch for 2 years, and the sky above them went from gold to deep rose to the dark blue of an approaching Kansas night. He did not kiss her that evening. He was not ready, and he knew it, and he thought she knew it too. But he held her hand, and she held his back, and it was a beginning. In early June the corn was 3 inches high, and the potato plants were thick and healthy, and the kitchen garden was producing the first small cucumbers, and the bean plants were climbing their twined trellises in a way that would have made Clara's garden plan proud. The farm looked like a working farm again. The fields that had been gray and empty and accusatory were green and purposeful, and Amos Keating found that standing on his own porch in the morning looking out at them produced a feeling that was not uncomplicated but was unmistakably alive. Virginia had been at the farm 6 weeks. The arrangement, per the terms of the placement service, was that after 60 days they were to formally decide whether to pursue courtship toward marriage. Both of them were aware of this without having spoken of it directly. The awareness gave the days a quality of gentle pressure, not unpleasant, the way the sky gets before a summer storm. They were working on the north fence one afternoon, replacing rotted posts, when Amos brought it up. They had been talking about nothing particular, and then they were not talking, and he said, "The 60 days." Virginia drove a nail and said, "Yes." "I do not want you to go back," he said. She lowered the hammer slowly. They were standing in the tall grass at the edge of the north pasture with the prairie rolling out around them and the sky overhead enormous and white and hot. "Then say more than that," she said, not unkindly. "Tell me what you mean." "I mean that you came here and you put your hands in my earth and you made me put my hands in it again," he said. "And I mean that every evening on that porch is the best part of my day, and I have been telling myself it is too soon and telling myself it is not fair to what I had before, and I have been going around and around it. But here is what I know." He paused. The wind came through the grass. "I am 34 years old and the land is planted and I am alive again in a way I was not, and you did that. And I would like to spend the rest of my time being alive like this, which means I need you to stay." Virginia was looking at him with an expression that was steady and open and completely unguarded, all of her formidable composure at rest for a moment. "You are not asking me to replace what you had," she said. "No," he said. "I am asking you to build something different. Something that is ours." She looked at him for a long time. Behind her the cornfield was a wall of green. Above her the Kansas sky was impossibly large. She was a woman who had come west with a carpetbag and a letter and dirt on her hands and the intention of being useful, and she had found something she had not put on her list of intentions, which was a man who was worth staying for. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." He stepped forward and took her face in his hands, those 2 large hands that had spent the last 2 months learning to hold a plow again, and before that had spent 14 months not knowing what they were for. And he kissed her once, carefully, in the noon light in the tall grass, with the repaired fence post standing between them and the smell of cut wood and prairie wind all around them. She kissed him back with a certainty that told him she had thought about this for more than one evening. When they separated, she was looking up at him with those dark eyes that he had thought from the first day were too direct, and that he had come to rely on for exactly that reason. "Do not tell Earl Duggan before I am ready," she said, and the humor in her voice was the warmth that lived underneath all of her practicality. Amos laughed. A real laugh, open and unguarded, the kind he had not produced in over a year, and that sounded strange and good in his own ears. "Earl is going to take complete credit," he said. "He should," Virginia said. "He earned it." They walked back to the farm in the afternoon light, the two of them, and Dutch watched them from the corral with the mild patience of a horse who has seen things, and the chickens went about their business, and the corn grew. The courtship, such as it was, had its own particular quality. They were not young people with an abundance of time to spend on the elaborate rituals of romance. They were two people in their 30s who had both been broken open by loss and had both, for different reasons, come to a place where another chance at a life was not something to be wasted on excessive caution. They were honest with each other. They talked in the evenings about real things, about what they wanted and what they were afraid of, and what they had learned about themselves from grief, and what they still did not understand. Virginia told him once, sitting on the porch on a hot June night with the fireflies coming up over the field, that what she had been most afraid of coming west was that she would come to a place where a man wanted a workhorse and not a woman, that she would be useful and practical and correct and invisible. "You have never been invisible to me," Amos said. "Not for 1 hour of one day." She looked at him with a softness that she did not show often, not because it was not there, but because she had learned to be careful with the soft parts. "I know that now," she said. He reached across the porch railing and took her hand in his. "Tell me what you want," he said. "Not what you think is practical, what you actually want." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to plant things and watch them grow," she said. "I want to wake up in the morning and know that what I do in a day matters. I want to eat supper with someone who talks to me like I have a mind worth talking to." She paused. "I want children," she said more quietly. "I wanted that with Daniel and it did not happen. I would like the chance." "Then you will have it," Amos said. She looked at him. "You are very certain." "I am certain about you," he said. "I have been certain about you since you climbed down off that stage with dirt on your hands and told me you were not interested in waiting when you could be working." Her face in the firefly light was beautiful, not in the decorative way of fashionable portraits, but in the way that a field is beautiful when it is fully planted and the crop is coming up straight, beautiful with purpose and health and abundance. "Then I want to marry you," she said, directly and simply and without embellishment, which was absolutely the way Virginia Rhodes would say such a thing. "Good," said Amos. "I want to marry you too." They went to Reverend Marsh the following week and made arrangements. The wedding was set for the 1st of July, which was far enough away to allow the practical preparations and close enough to satisfy neither of them being any more patient than they needed to be. Earl Duggan was indeed told and did indeed take complete credit, and Ruth Duggan cried in the happy way, and the news went around Harlow Creek with the speed that news in small towns always travels. There was one evening before the wedding when Amos did something he had been thinking about for a while. He went out to the east field at dusk, to the corner where the cottonwood stood over Clara's grave. Virginia had offered to come with him, and he had said he needed to go alone, and she had understood that without any additional explanation, which was one of the many things he loved about her. He stood at the grave for a long time. The cottonwood was fuller than last year, and its leaves made a sound in the wind that was like a conversation conducted in a language he could almost understand. The grave was marked with a proper stone that he had saved for and ordered from the stonemason in Dodge City in the first year, and it said Clara Ruth Keating, beloved wife, 1854–1882, and below that in his own insistence, words that the stonemason had looked at strangely but carved faithfully. She knew what the land had to say. "I am planting again," he told her. He said it out loud because he thought that was more honest than thinking it. "I am going to marry a woman who loves the land the way you did. I am going to try to be the man you told me to be when you told me not to let the land go to waste." He paused. The wind moved the cottonwood leaves. I think you would like her. I think you would have been friends in another world. She is honest and she is strong and she does not pretend things are smaller than they are." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for the garden plan you left in the pantry. She found it. We are following it." He stood there a while longer and then went back to the house where Virginia was making biscuits for supper, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of flour, and the lamp was lit against the early dark. She looked up when he came in and her eyes asked a question, and he answered it with a nod that meant he was all right, and she turned back to her biscuits, and he washed his hands at the pump and came to stand beside her at the counter and said, "Can I help?" "You can cut the lard in," she said, and slid the bowl toward him, and he rolled up his sleeves and put his hands in the dough. The 1st of July was a clear, fierce, high-sky Kansas day, the kind of day that seemed to have been specifically manufactured for significant occasions. Harlow Creek's small church was attended by virtually the entire town, because virtually the entire town had an opinion about Amos Keating getting married again, and wanted to see it with their own eyes. Ruth Duggan had organized a gathering of the women to help Virginia with her dress, which was a deep blue cotton that brought out the darkness of her eyes, and had been made in the week prior by Ruth and 2 other women who were evidently excellent seamstresses. Virginia walked into the church and looked at Amos standing at the front of it, cleaned up and in his good wool vest with his hair combed and his large hands steady at his sides, and she did not look away from him for the full length of the aisle. He watched her walk toward him and felt every good thing that he had been afraid for 14 months he had lost beyond recovery, felt it rise in him like a spring creek after rain, full and cold and clear and impossibly alive. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony with a simple dignity and an economy of language that suited them both. When they exchanged the words, the vows, the old words, Amos said them in a voice that was low and steady and meant every syllable. Virginia said them back in that direct and honest voice of hers that did not waver. Earl Duggan in the pew was crying, which he would later deny, and Ruth would confirm, and which would become a piece of Harlow Creek legend repeated for years afterward. The celebration afterward was in the churchyard under the cottonwoods, with tables set out, and food contributed by half the families in the township and fiddle music, from a man named Perkins who could make an instrument sound like it was laughing. Amos danced with Virginia in the way that a man dances who is not a skilled dancer but is entirely willing, and she laughed when he turned her the wrong direction twice, and the laugh was the warm, open sound he had heard first on the porch in the firefly light and had been collecting ever since. At some point in the evening, Earl Duggan found his way to Amos's side and stood there with his thumbs in his vest pockets looking at Virginia, who was talking with animation to a cluster of women about something related to crop rotation. "You are welcome," Earl said. "Thank you," said Amos, and he meant it from a place so deep that Earl, who was a direct man and knew sincerity when he encountered it, simply nodded and clapped him on the shoulder and went back to his wife. The summer was the best summer the farm had produced in 3 years. The corn came up strong and thick, the rows straight and abundant, and Amos walked them every morning the way Clara had walked the fields at dusk, and the land had plenty to say if a person was quiet enough. The potato patch produced a spectacular yield. The kitchen garden following Clara's garden plan gave them cucumbers and beans, and tomatoes that Virginia put up in the root cellar in careful mason jars, working in the summer kitchen in the evenings with her hair pinned up and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, singing occasionally, something she had not done for a while, and which she had apparently started doing again without noticing. She was singing one evening in early September when Amos came in from checking the stock and stood in the doorway listening. She turned and saw him and did not stop singing, just finished the verse and set down her jar and looked at him. "You are staring," she said. "I am," he said. "I like listening to you." She picked up the next jar. "I did not used to sing when I was at the boarding house," she said. "I suppose I had not felt like it." "What changed?" he asked. She gave him the look that said he was being deliberately obtuse. "You know what changed," she said. He came fully into the kitchen and crossed to her and put his arms around her from behind, his chin at her temple, and looked at the row of mason jars lined up on the counter, and the root cellar door standing open behind her, and the kitchen that had been quiet and mechanical for 2 years and was now warm and full of a voice. "Clara used to sing when she put up preserves," he said. "I had forgotten that." Virginia turned slightly in his arms. "Tell me about it," she said. She liked hymns, he said, particularly one about the river. She had a high voice. "Yours is lower." "Different songs then," Virginia said. "Different songs," he agreed. "The same kitchen." He kissed her temple. "I am glad of both." She leaned back against him and he held her in the late summer kitchen, and outside the corn was ready for harvest and the stars were coming up over the prairie. Harvest that fall was the kind of occasion that marks itself in memory as a clear point of before and after. They had corn enough to fill the barn loft, potatoes stored in the cellar in abundance, and a root cellar so full of jarred vegetables and dried beans that Virginia said with considerable satisfaction that they would eat well from November through April without hardship. Neighbors came to help with the corn harvest in the old tradition of community harvest work, and Amos worked alongside them for the first time in 2 years, and the work felt like being restored to membership in something he had not realized he had resigned from. Earl Duggan, sweating freely and wielding a corn knife with the enthusiasm of a man who was slightly showing off, paused at the end of a row and looked at the full wagon and then at Amos and said, "This is what this farm is supposed to look like." "I know," said Amos. "I lost sight of that for a while." "You found it again," Earl said. "That is what matters." Virginia was at the far end of the field directing a group of younger men in the stacking of corn shocks with a brisk authority that they were obeying without question, and Earl watched her with an expression of sincere admiration. "Remarkable woman," he said. "She is," said Amos. "You know what she is," said Earl, with the certainty of a man who has thought this through thoroughly. "She is the kind of woman who does not save a man so much as she hands him the tools and makes him save himself." Amos thought about this and said, "That is exactly right." "Of course it is," said Earl. "Ruth tells me everything." In October, Virginia told Amos that she was expecting. She told him on the porch on a cool evening with the harvested fields lying rested and brown around them. Told him in the straightforward way she had of telling important things, clearly and without any decoration, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on his face watching his reaction. His reaction was a full silence of several seconds during which his face moved through a series of things. The first thing it moved through was surprise, though he was not entirely surprised. The second was an emotion that had no clean name but was warm and enormous and made the back of his throat ache. The third was a deep, uncomplicated joy that came up from somewhere below all the complicated things and asserted itself simply and completely. "Virginia," he said. "I know," she said. She reached over and took his hand. "I know there are things in that. I know it is not without its complicated feelings." "No," he said, "it is not complicated. It is the simplest thing." "I am going to have a child with you." He turned to face her fully. "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "I am well," she said. "Somewhat tired in the mornings, otherwise well." "Then we will manage the mornings," he said. She smiled at him. "We will manage everything," she said. "That is generally what we do." He brought her hand up and kissed her knuckles and held her hand against his face for a moment, and the evening prairie was enormous around them, and the bare fields were resting after their first harvest in 3 years, and everything was, in the way that important things sometimes manage to be, exactly right. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a hard Kansas winter, the kind that settles in early and stays late, and makes the most experienced farmers pull out their savings carefully and count what they have. But they had the full root cellar and the full corn loft, and the winter wheat that Virginia had insisted on planting in September against the East Field's best section. And so the cold was hard but not desperate. They were warm and fed, and the farm was in better condition than it had been in years, because they had spent the whole growing season putting it back together. Amos used the winter mornings to repair and improve things around the farm that had been waiting since before Clara died, going through the list that Virginia had organized in her methodical way. The south side of the house that needed paint, which could wait for spring. The tack room in the barn that needed new shelving, which could be done in winter. The root cellar door that needed rehanging so it sealed properly against the cold. Virginia, as the winter progressed and her pregnancy became obvious, moved more carefully but did not stop working. She made a distinction between work that required heavy lifting, which she ceded to Amos, and work that required careful attention and good hands, which she kept doing. She organized the pantry with a system of labeling and rotation that Amos thought was elaborate and that in practice turned out to be exactly as useful as she claimed. She mended things. She made plans for the spring planting on paper at the kitchen table in the evenings, while Amos read by the lamp and the wind came off the prairie and hit the house in cold gusts. They read to each other sometimes. Amos had a small collection of books, a Bible, a battered copy of the works of Shakespeare that had belonged to his father, 2 almanacs, and a natural history of the prairies that Clara had ordered from a bookseller in Chicago. Virginia had brought with her a book of poetry and a seed catalog, and a medical guide for frontier households, which proved more practically useful than the poetry, but which she said was less pleasant before bedtime. They read Shakespeare to each other on winter evenings, in a way that was perhaps not precisely how Shakespeare intended his work to be encountered, but that was warm and ridiculous and occasionally very funny when one of them mispronounced a word, and the other did not correct them until the end of the scene. He told her once, looking up from the almanac on a February evening when the wind was particularly serious outside, and the lamp made the kitchen warm and orange, that he had not thought there was enough left in him to feel this way. That after Clara he had believed, in the honest private part of his mind that a person does not say out loud generally, that the part of him capable of this had gone with her, the warmth and the fullness of it, the way another person can make a house feel inhabited rather than occupied. Virginia put down her seed catalog and looked at him. "I know," she said. "I thought the same after Daniel. I thought perhaps I had used up whatever a person gets. That love was a thing a person had once and then the shape of it was spent. But here we are," Amos said. "Here we are," she said. "I think it is not a finite thing. I think grief makes it feel finite, but love is not actually a limited quantity. It does not diminish because it existed before." Clara would have said something like that, Amos said. She thought in terms of abundance, growing things. "Then she taught you well," Virginia said, "and perhaps some of that is in the land itself. Perhaps when you came back to it, some of it came back to you." He thought about this for a long time, turning it over the way he turned soil, looking at what was underneath it. "I think you are right," he said. "I think the land held something for me, while I was not able to." "The earth is patient," Virginia said, and he remembered that she had written those words in her letter before they had met, and that they had been the line he had gone back to most. The baby came in the last week of May, 1884. A boy. Ruth Duggan came as the attending woman, which was the way of it on the frontier where formal doctors were a distance away, and women managed what needed managing with skill and steadiness. The labor was difficult, and Long and Amos spent most of it on the porch, because being inside while Virginia was in pain, and not being able to do anything useful, was a situation he handled by walking the porch boards approximately 200 times and talking to Dutch in the corral in a low and mostly incoherent murmur. When Ruth came to the porch door and said the baby was here and Virginia was asking for him, Amos went inside with his heart going at a rate that Dutch had noted with some equine alarm. Virginia was in the bed looking exhausted in the absolute, wrung-out way of a woman who has done the hardest work there is and knows it, and in her arms was a small, red, furious creature who had apparently not yet decided whether he wanted to be in this world. Amos sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, and then at Virginia, and could not find any words that were equal to the occasion. "He is healthy," Virginia said, in the tired and certain voice of a woman who had already checked. 10 fingers and 10 toes. Good lungs, as you can perhaps hear. Amos put out one of his 2 large hands, and the baby's fist closed around his finger with a grip that was remarkable for its size and insistence. The grip of something that had arrived with an opinion about staying. "What do you want to call him?" Amos asked. Virginia had thought about this. "Thomas," she said, "after my father." "Thomas Keating," Amos said, trying the sound of it. "That is a good name." "It is," said Virginia. "He will grow into it." Amos leaned forward and kissed Virginia's temple very carefully, the way a person handles something they understand to be of great value. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I am extremely tired," she said, "but I accept the compliment." Ruth Duggan, in the doorway, smiled with the satisfaction of a woman who has witnessed the best possible outcome of something she has been hoping for. Thomas Keating grew into his name with the enthusiastic speed of a child raised on good Kansas soil, and the particular variety of love produced by 2 people who had each been lost for a while, and found each other, and did not take finding for granted. He was a round, cheerful, serious baby who became a round, cheerful, serious toddler with his mother's dark eyes and his father's large hands, which showed up early as an indicator of some future size, and who from the time he could walk followed Virginia around the kitchen garden, with the expression of a person receiving information they intend to use. Virginia put a small trowel in his hands before his 2nd birthday, and he used it without hesitation to dig into the garden soil with the competent delight of a child doing something he was born to do. Amos watched from the garden fence one afternoon in the summer of 1885 as Virginia crouched beside Thomas and showed him how to make a furrow for bean seeds, her hands guiding his hands, the same hands that had first arrived in Harlow Creek with red-brown Missouri soil still on them. She looked up and saw him watching and said, "He is a natural." "He has a good teacher," Amos said. Thomas looked up from his furrow and said, "Bean," with enormous authority, holding up a seed. "That is correct," Amos said. "In the ground," Thomas said, and put it in the furrow and covered it over with the concentration of an engineer. And Virginia met Amos's eyes over their son's head, and they shared the particular wordless communication of 2 people who are profoundly glad of the same thing at the same time. The farm continued to grow. The spring of 1885 brought the best wheat harvest Amos had seen since before Clara's death, and that summer he began to think about expanding the corn acreage onto the slope that had been used for nothing since he bought the land. He talked to Virginia about it over supper, and she pulled out her planning papers and had 3 different proposed configurations sketched by the following morning, with notes on soil amendment and water management. "You thought about this overnight," he said. "I always think about the land overnight," she said. "You know this." "I do," he said. "I love it about you." She looked up from her papers with a warmth that still, 2 years after their marriage, hit him in the same place it had always hit him. "Which configuration do you prefer?" she asked. "Yours," he said. "I have 3, she said patiently. "The one you are most proud of," he said. "Which I know is the middle one because that is the one you drew first." She looked at the papers. "That is correct," she said, as if surprised by him. "How did you know?" "Because I know you," he said simply. She folded the papers and then unfolded them again to look at the middle one and said, without looking up, "I am glad that you know me." "I intend to spend a considerable number of years continuing to," he said. In August of 1885, a piece of trouble arrived in Harlow Creek in the form of a land speculator named Hutchins who came through town, with papers claiming that he had purchased a right-of-way through the south end of several farms, including Amos's, for a planned cattle road. The claim was legally dubious, the kind of thing that Western land speculators regularly tried in the period, relying on the isolation of farmers from legal recourse and the general confusion of territorial land records. Several farmers in the township were alarmed. Virginia, who had a practical and systematic mind, sat down with Amos's original land deed and the papers Hutchins presented and spent a careful evening going through them. She had grown up watching her father deal with exactly this kind of thing, and she had paid attention. She found 3 discrepancies in the right-of-way documentation, including a boundary reference that did not match the county survey on record, and presented her findings to Amos with a marked document. "This is not legitimate," she said flatly. "I thought as much," said Amos, "but I could not have found what you found." "Take this to the county clerk in Dodge City," she said, "and get Earl Duggan and the Pearson brothers and whoever else this affects to go with you." A group of men at a clerk's office carries more weight than one man. Amos did exactly this. He organized 6 of the affected farmers and drove to Dodge City and spent a day at the county clerk's office with Virginia's documented discrepancies in hand. And the right-of-way claim was found to be unregistered and invalid, and Hutchins was informed that continued pursuit of the matter would result in formal complaint to the Territorial Land Office. Hutchins departed Harlow Creek. The crisis was resolved. On the ride back from Dodge City, Earl Duggan rode alongside Amos for a stretch of the road and said, "Virginia found all of that in one evening." "She did," said Amos. "You could not have done it without her," Earl said. "No," said Amos. "I could not have done most of the last 2 years without her." Earl was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who has something large to say and is organizing it. "You know," he said at last, "when I wrote that letter to the placement service, I thought I was fixing a problem. Man needs help on his farm, woman needs a place to go, straightforward. I did not understand what I was actually doing." "What were you actually doing?" Amos asked. "I was giving you back to yourself," Earl said. "And her to herself, and I did not plan it that way. I just thought about the empty field." He shook his head. "Sometimes the right thing looks simpler than it is." Amos rode in silence for a moment, looking out at the prairie rolling past, the late afternoon sun flat and golden on the grasses. "Earl," he said, "the next time you feel the urge to interfere in my life without asking me, I want you to know that you have my blessing." Earl laughed, the big, broad laugh of a man who is happy. "Ruth will be glad to hear that," he said. "That fall Virginia was pregnant again." She told Amos in October when the harvest was in, and the root cellar was once again thoroughly stocked, and Thomas was 18 months old and walking everywhere, and saying a remarkable number of words for his age. She told him with the same directness she brought to everything, and this time he did not have the long silence he had the first time. He simply crossed the kitchen and held her for a long moment, and she held him back. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Abundantly," he said. "Good," she said, "because I require at least 3 more months of someone else doing the heavy lifting in the root cellar." He laughed and pulled back and looked at her face. That face he had been looking at for over 2 years now, and that continued to be one of his favorite things to look at on any given day, and said, "I will carry everything you need carried." "I know you will," she said. "You always do." The second baby arrived in June of 1885, another boy they named William, who came into the world with considerably less drama than his brother, and immediately settled into a general disposition of peaceful observation that would remain characteristic of him. Thomas regarded his new brother with the proprietary interest of a toddler, who is not entirely sure if this new addition is an asset or a complication, and ultimately decided, over the course of a few weeks, that it was acceptable. The farm in the summer of 1885 was a different place from what it had been 3 years before. The fields were fully in production. The fence lines were repaired and maintained. The south wall of the house had been painted the previous spring, a warm cream color that Virginia had chosen from a swatch card at Curtis Bell's store. The kitchen garden was abundant, and following a slightly modified version of Clara's original plan, modified because Virginia had her own views about what went where and had communicated them to the garden over 2 seasons. There was, growing at the back of the kitchen garden, a rose bush. Amos had ordered it from a catalog in the winter of 1884 and planted it in the spring, not saying anything to Virginia about why, and she had come around the corner of the house one morning to find it there, a young bush with 3 red blooms just opening, and had stood looking at it for a long moment. "Where did this come from?" she had asked. "I ordered it," Amos said. "Clara always wanted one. I never ordered it when she was alive because I kept saying there would be time." He looked at the rose. "I thought perhaps we could have it now." Virginia had stood beside the rose for a long time and Amos had not spoken, and after a while she had said, "It will need some shelter from the west wind." "I thought we could put up a small trellis," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will find the right spot for it." She had found the spot and built the trellis herself, which was exactly right. By 1885, the rose was well established and produced flowers from June through August, and Virginia brought them into the house and put them in a glass jar on the kitchen table, and they were both aware of all the layers of what they meant, of past and present, and the insistence of growing things to keep growing. On an evening in late summer of 1885, Amos walked out to the east field at dusk in the old habit he had developed since the planting had started again. He stood at the end of the rows and listened to the corn and the wind, and he walked back along the edge of the field to the cottonwood tree in the far corner where Clara's gravestone stood. He went there regularly now, not in grief the way he had at first, but in the quiet way of a person visiting someone they have not forgotten. He said, as he sometimes said when he came here, whatever was on his mind. He told her about William. He told her about the rose and that Virginia had built it a trellis. He told her that the garden was following her plan, more or less, with some adjustments in the northeast corner. He said that Thomas had her same quality of going still when he was outside, as though he was listening to something. "He might be," Amos said to the stone. "If you have things to tell him, that would be fine with me." The cottonwood moved in the evening wind. He stood there until the light went fully, and then walked back to the house, where the lamp was lit in the kitchen window, and the smell of supper was coming out the door. And inside, he could hear Virginia's voice and Thomas's voice in the particular rhythm of a mother and a young child working something out. And William was probably in his cradle making his quiet observations. He stood outside the door for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, looking in through the window at the lit kitchen, at Virginia moving at the stove with her sleeves rolled up, at Thomas sitting at the table with a biscuit and his particular expression of serious concentration. Then he opened the door and went in. Virginia looked over her shoulder at him. "You are back from the field," she said. "I am," he said. He went to her and kissed her cheek, and she turned her face into the kiss in the easy way of a person very comfortable with the person kissing them. "What are we having?" "Salt pork and late tomatoes from the garden and biscuits," she said. "Thomas has already had one biscuit and I believe he is attempting a second and pretending I cannot see him." Thomas looked up with a perfectly blank expression and then back down at the biscuit, which he then moved unhurriedly behind his back. Amos sat down across from his son. "How was your afternoon?" he asked Thomas. "Bean," Thomas said, which was still his word of confidence deployed in various contexts. He brought the biscuit out from behind his back and took a large bite, apparently deciding that blatancy was a better strategy than stealth. "That is approximately correct," Amos agreed. Virginia put supper on the table and sat down and they ate, the 4 of them in the warm kitchen with the lamp going and the September dark outside and the root cellar full and the corn harvested and the winter wheat planted 2 weeks ago now settling into the soil and beginning the slow work of its first roots. 3 years. Amos thought sometimes about the 3 years since Virginia had stepped off the stage with dirt on her hands. He thought about how different it was to mark time by planting seasons again. You could measure a life that way, what you put in the ground and when, what came up, what you saved for next year, what you added to and what you carried forward. The farm was his and Virginia's now in a way that felt entirely different from the way it had been anyone's before, not erasing what had been but building genuinely on top of it. the way good land works, incorporating what came before into what grows now. They had a full root cellar and 2 sons and a rose bush, and a field of winter wheat settling into good dark soil. And Virginia's hands were never entirely free of earth, which was one of his favorite things about her. The way the land was always on her hands, and in the lines of her wrists, and under her nails, the evidence of a person completely committed to where they were. In October, he ordered her a second seed catalog from a different company that carried varieties she had mentioned not being able to find locally. And when it arrived, she opened it at the kitchen table and went through it with the intense pleasure of a reader encountering a particularly good book, making small sounds of interest and marking pages with scraps of paper, while Thomas climbed in and out of her lap, and William slept in his cradle beside the stove. Amos watched her from across the table over the top of the almanac. "What is that expression?" she asked without looking up from the catalog. "Which expression?" he said. "The one you have when you are looking at me and thinking something you have not decided whether to say," she said, still not looking up. He put down the almanac. "I was thinking," he said, "that I want to tell you something." Now she looked up. Her eyes were direct and warm and waiting. "I want to tell you," he said, "that I think about the spring you arrived fairly often. The morning I came downstairs and found you already in the field with your hands in the soil. The way you stood up and held up your hands with all the dirt on them and told me what I had here, as if it were something I needed to be introduced to." "You did need to be introduced to it again," she said, gently. "I did," he said, "and you did it without embarrassing me. You just showed me what was there." He paused. "I want to say thank you for that. I know I may not say it in ways that are sufficiently clear." Virginia put the catalog down. Her dark eyes were doing the thing they did when she was feeling something that she was also thinking about both at once. "You say it clearly every day," she said. "You say it the way you say things, in what you do and not just what you say." "I want to say it in the words too," he said. "Then say it," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for coming here, for the dirt on your hands on the first day, for standing in my field and making me stand in it too, for all of the mornings and the evenings and the seed catalogs and the kitchen garden and the beans and Thomas saying bean and William being extremely peaceful about everything, for the rosebush, for staying." Virginia's face had gone soft in the way it went when she was allowing all of it through at once. "You do not have to thank me," she said. "Being here is not a sacrifice. Being here with you and this farm and these boys is exactly what I wanted, and I know it now every day when I wake up." "I know," he said, "but I want you to hear it from me directly." She got up from her chair and came around the table and sat on the bench beside him and took his face in her hands the way he had taken her face the first time he kissed her, those rough, capable hands warm on his jaw. She looked at him. "I love you, Amos Keating," she said. "I have loved you since about the 3rd day I was here, and I have been absolutely clear about it for a long time." "Since the 3rd day," he said. "You handed me the seed corn to check and trusted my judgment entirely without hedging," she said. "It was the 3rd morning. I thought, this is a man I could be with." "I love you," he said, and the words came up from the same deep place they always came from when he said them to her, from below the practical and the daily and the comfortable, from the deep stratum where the real things lived. From approximately the moment you walked across the street in Harlow Creek directly at me without hesitating. She kissed him and he put his arms around her and they sat in the warm kitchen, and outside the autumn Kansas dark was full of stars, and the fields were resting, and the winter wheat was in the ground doing the invisible patient work of first roots. Thomas, who had fallen asleep in the chair across the table with his head on his arms, breathed steadily. William in his cradle made his quiet, watching sounds. The lamp burned. The rosebush outside was past its blooms now and hunkered in for the coming cold, but its roots were deep, and the spring would bring it back. The months that followed settled into the rhythm of a family that had found its shape. Winters spent in close domestic warmth, planning and mending and reading aloud, and the boys growing. Thomas into a sturdy and talkative 3-year-old, who wanted to be in the barn at every opportunity, and who called Dutch by name, and had already figured out that if he stood perfectly still beside the horse's shoulder, Dutch would lower his big head and nose his hair. William into an observant and surprisingly cheerful 1-year-old who had none of Thomas's intensity, but all of his mother's patience. The spring of 1886 came in wet and cold, and then, in April, warm all at once in the way of Kansas springs that decide everything at once. The winter wheat had come through beautifully and stood in the east field bright green and promising. Virginia and Amos walked it together on the first warm morning of April, while Ruth Duggan watched the boys, a tradition they had established of walking the winter wheat in early spring together. Two people who understood that doing this together was its own kind of ceremony. She took his hand when they were halfway down the row. He laced his fingers through hers. The wheat came to their knees, and the morning light was new, and the sky above was the particular pure blue that comes right after a hard winter, as though the sky itself had been washed. "Third season of winter wheat," she said. "And the best," he said. "It is the best," she agreed. "The soil is better than it was when I came, better managed." "You managed it," he said. "We managed it," she said, squeezing his hand. They walked the whole length of the field in the morning, and came back along the fence, and stood at the corner where they could see both the winter wheat and the east bottomland where the corn would go again in 6 weeks, and the kitchen garden plot where the earth had been turned the week before and was waiting for seed. Virginia looked at all of it, and then up at the sky, and then at him, and her face was open and certain in the way of someone who is entirely where they intended to be. "We should put in another section of corn this year," she said. "The northwest corner where you were thinking in '85. The soil amendment has had time to work." "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "And I want to try sunflowers along the north fence," she said. "I had them at home in Missouri. They are good for the soil, and Thomas would love them." "Thomas would love them," he agreed. "And I want a proper smokehouse," she said. "We have been managing without, and it is costing us in preservation." "I will build it before harvest," he said. "I know you will," she said, and the confidence in her voice, the absolute matter-of-fact certainty that he would do what he said, was one of the things he found most sustaining about her. Her faith in him delivered so practically and completely that it never felt like pressure, only like solid ground. They walked back to the house and collected the boys from Ruth Duggan and fed everyone breakfast, and the day began in the way days began on the farm, with the chickens and the cow and the particular first morning tasks that organized everything else. Amos stood at the kitchen window with his coffee, watching Virginia carry Thomas on her hip toward the chicken yard with a basket for eggs, Thomas holding onto her hair with the grip that toddlers use, and that she tolerated with the patience of a woman who has more important things to think about. And he thought with a clarity that surprised him in its fullness that this was the life he had been meant for. Not just this farm or this work, though those were themselves genuine gifts. The this of it was the specific, particular, complete life of this woman, and these 2 boys, and this kitchen and the fields outside, and the horse in the corral, and the rosebush and Clara's garden plan on the pantry shelf, where Virginia had put it back after that first planting, reverently, where it remained. He had not planted a seed for 2 years out of a grief so large it had swallowed his capacity for beginning anything. And then Virginia Rhodes had arrived with dirt on her hands and a directness in her dark eyes, and had walked into his fallow field at sunrise, and turned his soil in her hands, and told him what he had. He had planted corn that spring, and it had come up straight and full, and the land, which was patient and had been waiting, had given back everything he had been unable to ask it for. He finished his coffee, and set the mug on the counter, and went out to help Virginia with the chickens. She handed him the egg basket without looking up from where she was checking on the water trough. 7 eggs already, she said. That new hen is finally producing. She just needed time, he said. Virginia glanced at him with a look that contained considerable amusement at the metaphor she correctly suspected he was making. "She did," Virginia said. "They usually do." He took the egg basket and she took Thomas back, and they crossed the yard together in the spring light, and the farm was alive all around them, the sounds and smells of a working land that had been given back to itself, and the morning was just beginning. The years built themselves the way good years do on land that is loved and tended, one into the next with the particular satisfaction of work that compounds on itself, each season richer for the ones before it. By 1887, the farm had the smokehouse Amos had promised, and the sunflowers along the north fence that Thomas loved ferociously, and that Virginia had been right would help the soil. There was a third child on the way, and Virginia moved through this pregnancy with the competent ease of a woman who had done it before and knew her own body's capacities. The third child was a girl. Ruth Duggan said, when she put her in Virginia's arms that November evening, that she was as beautiful as her mother, which was a compliment Virginia deflected by saying she had her father's stubbornness in the set of her chin, which was accurate. They named her Clara. They had talked about this name before carefully and honestly, the way they talked about things that mattered. Virginia had proposed it, and Amos had gone quiet for a moment and then said, "Are you sure? It is yours to decide." "It is ours to decide," Virginia had said, "and I am sure. It is a good name and I want to carry it forward. She was part of how we got here." Amos had held Virginia's hands in his large hands and looked at her with everything he felt for her clear in his face, and he said, "It is a perfect name." Baby Clara Keating came into the world on a cold November evening and was placed in her father's arms while Virginia rested, and Amos held his daughter and looked at her small, determined face and thought about all the layers of what a name could hold, grief and gratitude and love, and the way one life flowers sometimes from another, not replacing but continuing, the way a field that has been through its hardest winter comes up greenest in the spring. Thomas, age 4, was taken in to see his new sister with the solemnity appropriate to the occasion, and looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Bean," with the authority that was his standard response to things he found significant. "Roughly," said his father. William, 2 years old, simply reached out and patted his sister's head with the gentle, approving manner of a diplomat recognizing a new colleague. Virginia, watching this from the bed, said to Amos, "She is going to have those two looking out for her whole life." "She will not need looking out for," Amos said. "She has your chin." "All the same," Virginia said. He came and sat beside her, and she leaned against him, and the lamp was warm, and outside the November wind was cold, and the fields were resting under the first edge of winter, and inside the house was so full of life and warmth that it seemed to push back against the dark entirely. He put his arm around her, and she settled against his side with the ease of a woman who has been beside this man for 4 years and knows exactly where she fits. "Are you happy?" he asked, because he asked her sometimes, and he would always ask her, and he would always want to know. "Amos," she said, and her voice was full and certain, "I am more happy than I knew I was allowed to be." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Same," he said. The farm went forward. The seasons turned the way seasons do when a person is paying full attention to them, each one distinct and necessary. Spring with its urgent planting and the annual ceremony of Virginia and Amos walking the winter wheat together. Summer with its long labor and long light, and the smell of growing corn, and Virginia in the kitchen garden with the children around her ankles. Fall with the abundance of harvest and the root cellar filling, and the satisfaction of a year's work become tangible. Winter with the quiet and the planning and the reading aloud, and the lamp and the warmth. Clara Keating, as she grew, was indeed possessed of her mother's chin and her father's hands, and an absolute certainty about what she thought that manifested in a toddler as something between charming and overwhelming. Thomas and William did in fact look out for her, in the ways that older brothers do, and she tolerated this protection with the patience of someone who understood she could handle things herself, but appreciated the company. Virginia's kitchen garden was, by 1888, the most productive kitchen garden in the county, a fact that Curtis Bell mentioned in the Mercantile one day to a visiting merchant who was impressed by the range of preserved goods on the Keating family's order receipts. Several women in Harlow Creek came to Virginia for advice on soil amendment and planting timing, and she gave it freely, the way she gave everything, with directness and without withholding. She was 31 years old and completely in her element, which was to say that she was in good soil and putting things in it and watching what grew. Amos at 37 was the man he had been meant to be all along, the one who laughed easily and told stories that made people feel good and leaned against fence posts with an ease that came from being genuinely at ease. He had his grief still, the clean, settled grief of someone who has made peace with loss without forgetting it. He went to Clara's grave at the Cottonwood in the East Field, with the regular quiet faithfulness of a man who keeps his debts. But the other version of himself, the one that had been present and absent at once, the one that had passed his empty fields without looking, that version was gone. Virginia Rhodes had walked into his field and turned his soil in her hands, and that version had been turned under too. And what had come up was this version, the one standing in his kitchen in the morning light, surrounded by the noise and warmth of 3 children and a wife who loved him with the same practical completeness she brought to everything she loved, which was also to say entirely. He thought sometimes about the letter she had sent him before they met. The last line, added after the rest in smaller script, that she preferred working land to waiting. He knew what she meant now, understood it in his own body the way a farmer understands soil, not abstractly but from having put his hands in it. A person could wait in grief indefinitely, and the grief would simply accumulate around them like silt, filling in every space. Or a person could work, could put their hands in the earth and turn something over and plant something and wait for it in the active way, the way that meant you were present while you waited, watching and tending. Virginia had known that before she arrived. She had known it from whatever long consideration had gone into that last line added to a letter before sealing it to send to a stranger in Kansas. He had learned it from her. He had learned it in his own fields. On a morning in early May of 1888, Virginia came downstairs to find Amos already in the kitchen garden, which was unusual. She stood at the kitchen door with her coffee and watched him. He was crouched at the south end of the garden, the tomato section, which was the corner that got the best morning sun according to Clara's original plan, and which Virginia had maintained in that use because Clara had been entirely correct. He was putting in the tomato seedlings they had started in the cold frame at the beginning of April. He was doing it with the careful, precise attention that Virginia had taught him, the right depth and the right spacing and the soil firmed around each root properly, not too loose and not packed down. He was doing it exactly right. She stood there with her coffee and watched him in the morning light and loved him with the full, uncomplicated force of a woman who has made a choice, and made it again, every day, and knows each time that it is the right choice. She came down the porch steps and walked across the garden to him and crouched down beside him and looked at the tomato seedlings he had placed. "The spacing is right," she said. "I had a good teacher," he said, and looked at her sideways with that expression she had come to know as well as her own reflection, the one that held everything he felt and said it without saying it. "Let me get the next row," she said, and put her hand in the soil beside his, and they planted the tomatoes together in the early morning with the dew still on the garden and the children still asleep in the house and the vast Kansas sky beginning to pale toward blue above them. And the land received everything they put into it with the patience that was its particular and ancient generosity, and gave back, as good land does, more than was planted. The fields that spring were full. Every row of them, the corn and the wheat and the potatoes and the kitchen garden south of the house, with its tomatoes and beans and cucumbers following the plan that had been made by a woman whose love for the land had been left in the soil itself, waiting. Everything planted, everything growing. The farmhouse needed no explanation for what it was. It was a home, full and loud and warm and grounded, The way homes are when the people in them have earned their happiness by understanding what it cost and choosing it anyway. Thomas would help his father walk the fields every evening for the rest of his growing years, learning the language the land spoke at dusk, the one his grandmother had known, and his mother had known, and his father had come back to. William would grow into a quieter version of the same education, more watcher than talker, the kind of farmer who listens before he acts and whose crops are always healthy for the quality of his attention. Clara would grow into the ownership of her own name in ways that surprised and delighted them, fierce and capable and possessed of a certainty about the earth that showed up in her before she could properly hold a trowel, which she managed young and early and with enormous authority. And Virginia Rhodes, who had come west on the southbound stage in April of 1883 with a carpetbag and a letter, and the calluses of a working woman on her hands, would stand in her kitchen garden every spring morning for the rest of her years with her hands in the soil of a farm that had waited for her the way good land waits, patiently and abundantly and without giving up, and know that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Amos Keating had not planted a single seed for 2 years after his wife's grave was dug, and then Virginia Rhodes had showed up with dirt on her hands and changed that. And the earth, which had been patient, came alive again, and so did he, and so did everything.